In learning about the history and development of negotiable instruments, it is important to understand and know the early media of exchange. Before coinage and other representations of money were instituted, the principal media of exchange were cattle and skins, which, through time and civilization, eventually evolved to metal whose currency representation depended on its weight.
Negotiable instruments form an integral part of our financial system today. It has paved the way for faster circulation of money and an increase in commerce. Nevertheless, before one can discuss the concept of negotiable instruments, it is important to first understand how these small sheets of paper, which carry so much effect and importance in the economy, were introduced. As the main objective of this article is to trace the development of negotiable instrument and laws governing the same, it is first essential that we understand why we are even using its equivalent in the first place as a media of exchange. Join me today in this historical journey through time as we understand the origins of money. Prior to the introduction of money, trade primarily came in the form of cattle and their skins. Over time, civilization would evolve, and with it, better forms of currency which were much more efficient at their purpose. Prior to the introduction of money, the earliest stated system of bartering can be found in Mesopotamia during 6000 BC. The primary means of commerce was done through trade, be it foods, weapons, or other goods. While an early form of commerce, it was really good at the time, but if it were applied into a modern setting, you could only imagine just how much of a hassle this would be. To put it into perspective, here is a clip to show what it would likely look like in modern times.
Yung bayad mo sa mayari yung bahay. Sa amin sa Muleto, kahit saan ka tumira, walang kailangan kabayaran.
Oh, yun naman pala. Malakas yung kayo sa inyo. Alis na go, babay, take care. Ay, naku.
Sige. Umayag ka na. Isang dosen ng itlog araw-araw, 2 manok tuwing makalawa, at isang tiglis na isda kada linggo.
Ano ang akala mo yung sapat ko? Palengke. Nakakalungkot.
Agema.
Now, while barter might have served its purpose in history, it was met with some very obvious inconveniences, one of which was the fact that goods would travel really slowly. They would flow very slow, and this system would eventually be replaced with something much more convenient with the introduction of other forms of currency. The earliest known currency was found in China, with the West eventually picking it up through the Lydians in 650 BC. The use of Lydian currency assisted the Lydians in becoming one of the richest empires in Asia Minor. Throughout history, various prominent empires such as the Romans, Aztecs, Persians, and Ottomans learned to use the coins as the basis for their monetary system. This was due to the simple fact they all share the series of unique characteristics of scarcity, divisibility, and portability. Gold and silver was practically impossible to copy. But just like their previous equivalent, coins also had a great share of drawbacks, the most glaring being the fact that if a man had to visibly carry a large sacks of coins around, it would practically be putting a large target on his back to robbers and other men contrary to the law. Hence, they needed an alternative that was even more convenient than coins that have already been developed. Though paper money was found in China all the way back in the 13th century under the Yuan dynasty, it was not until the age of colonialism where paper money would find its way to the Western world, as the use of metals was inconvenient if it were to be transferred all the way back from Europe to the New World. And though paper money only really became widespread during the colonial era, there was a point in time in the 12th and 13th century where European traders were able to develop a different means of conducting business that would also ease in the flow of goods. This was the predecessor to what we know today as the negotiable instrument. Negotiable instruments, or at the very least their equivalent, were born in the medieval era by reason of the acts of merchants from Italian city-states such as the Venetians and the Maltese. The exact origin for their coming to being is often debated by historians, One group believes that they came by reason of spontaneity and convenience, simply because they wanted a more convenient means of doing business. Another group believes that they actually derived this idea from the East, and as such it was later introduced to Europe by such merchants. Regardless of origin, the fact of the matter remains that by reason of this introduction, it would significantly ease commerce and give birth to the financial instrument we know today.
The following are examples of China's negotiable currency. First, pianze, or convenient money. These were payable on demand and issued in exchange for deposits with the government of various quantities of common products of trade, to which the bonds must be converted. Next, quanze. These were China bills used in paying army contracts. And lastly, tsingti. These were ordinary promissory notes. Meanwhile, the promissory notes in continental Europe paved their way during the 12th and 13th centuries in connection with trading contracts for carriage of goods by sea, specifically in the North European towns such as Hamburg and Lübeck.
Bili na mga suke! 20% discount on all our merch for law students. Ma'am, bili na! This is very in demand. Ito po yung pinakamabenta namin this month.
Uy, ang kagwapo naman. Sino yan? K-pop ba yan?
Ito talaga si ma'am. The shirt only costs 5,000 pesos, ma'am. 5,000. Afford na afford mo to.
Naku, 5,000? Ano yan gawa sa Talyano Gold?
Ma'am, this professor is very in demand. Napakahusay. And this shirt is truly, look at the quality. One of its kind, ma'am. O diba? Bilhin mo na, 5,000 lang.
Sige, nagmamadali na kasi ako. So, mag-i-issue na lang ako ng check in your favor. Pero, ikaw na maglagay ng ng amount, ha? Sige, bigay ko na lang to sa'yo. Dapat, bigay mo lang lagay mo lang dyan 5,000, okay? 5,000 lang, ha? Walang labis, pero okay lang kung kulang. Sige, siya, labas na ako.
However, instead of 5,000 pesos, Lori puts the amount of 50,000 pesos. Lori likewise signed the same and endorsed the same to a holder in due course. Now, if the holder in due course comes to Jana, can the holder in due course collect 50,000 from Jana? Yes, pursuant to Section 14 of the NIL, and I quote, "But if any instrument after completion is negotiated to a holder in due course, it is valid and effectual for all purposes in his hands, and he may enforce it as if it had been filled up strictly in accordance with the authority given and within a reasonable time." So here, this is merely a personal defense.
But why are you penalizing me? At parang kasalanan ko. I merely entrusted my check to a scammer.
Well, it's pretty simple actually. It's just because of your stupidity. Char, joke lang. Anyway, negligence lang po in entrusting the instrument to a person. When you're talking about negotiable instruments, I don't think it would be wise for you to trust somebody just because. So, hindi ka dapat magtiwala basta-basta.
Negotiable instruments were commonly used for a considerable time before they became the subject of law or legislation. Through the developments of negotiable instruments, commercial paper or other similar instruments have now become convenient for both customers and merchants to use, most especially as a substitute for money. By law, negotiable instruments have been defined under the Negotiable Instruments Law, primarily in Section 1, where the provision states the requirements an instrument must conform to become a negotiable instrument. Essentially, as previously stated, negotiable instruments are a convenient substitute for money. When the person to whom payment is to be made is unable to obtain cash from their customers, the former will take promissory notes, accepted bills, or some form of commercial paper, which accepting banks will turn into money. However, the importance of a negotiable instrument does not only limit itself in becoming a substitute for money. Negotiability enhances commerce, and in addition to bills of exchange, promissory notes, and checks, there are other documents deemed as negotiable instruments. The purpose of negotiability is to allow the bills and notes to go from hand to hand in the commercial markets and to take the part of money in commercial transactions. Men in this way without cash in hand are enabled by means of credit to conduct and carry to completion business enterprises upon their promissory notes.
bills of exchange, and checks, knowing that other businessmen will treat these promises as cash. Necessity of negotiable instruments has significance of itself as indicating certain legal features and consequences that are not common to commercial instruments generally. Say, if a personal property or a non-negotiable instrument is stolen, no person, however innocent of the theft, can acquire title against the real owner, because the real owner may at any place and at any time identify his property and reclaim it. However, if a negotiable instrument which is payable to bearer has been stolen and transferred by the thief to a third person, the person, namely a holder in due course, so acquiring it, may hold it against the world. So through these rules of negotiability, transferees, namely holders in due course, can acquire rights in the negotiable instrument transferred that exceed the rights held by their transfers, which may be the maker, drawer, or endorser.
Magsusulat ako ng cheque. Ng cheque. Ipapangalan ko kay Lorraine 10,000. 10,000 kay Lorraine. Pero, iiwan ko lang yung cheque sa desk ko kasi a-attend ako ng party. Iiwan ko yung cheque sa lamesa ko, nakapangalan kay Lorraine, 10,000. Yan. Ay, naiwan?
Wow, may cheque nakapangalan sa akin 10,000. Mukhang mababayaran ko na yung utang ko kay Inat.
Holder in due course pala ako.
Can Inat claim from Jana? Yes. Section 16 of the Negotiable Instruments Law provides that where the instrument is in the hands of a holder in due course, a valid delivery thereof by all parties prior to him, so as to make them liable to him, is conclusively presumed.
Laws in the United Kingdom. Although the use of money and coins were already practiced during the Anglo-Saxon period, no evidence was ever found that shows that Saxons or even Vikings used any kind of negotiable instruments in England. In fact, no record of any laws or ordinances was ever discovered that shows that negotiable instrument laws were enacted. Historians infer that negotiable instruments were only introduced in England during the 11th to 12th centuries. During the 12th century, it was the Italian moneylenders and merchants who introduced the concept of the bill of exchange to the English. Originally, it was used to evidence credit and debt, which was then negotiated at that time. It was only during the 13th century that the use of bills of exchange was made official by law. In the 13th century, England was facing an international problem where their coins were being counterfeited or stolen by foreign merchants transacting with locals. King Richard II enacted a law that officially mandated the use of bills of exchange and prohibited the use of coins, gold, and silver when transacting with foreign merchants. The law simplified and expedited transacting with foreign merchants and payment of debts. Under this law, however, bills of exchange were only used exclusively when transacting with foreign merchants and was not used for local commercial transactions. However, during the 1600s, bills of exchange was already used by locals, but no official law was enacted yet that regulates its use. Thereafter, during the 1700s, the Parliament officially extended its use to domestic traders and then finally to all persons, whether merchants or not. On the other hand, promissory notes became prominent only during the 17th century. In numerous separate cases, Chief Justice Holt held that promissory notes are not negotiable and only evidence an already existing debt. It did not have negotiable character. Later on, its negotiability was clarified by the Statute of Anne of 1704, which made promissory notes negotiable just like bills of exchange. During the 1800s, England had numerous laws regarding the conduct and use of negotiable instruments enacted already. In 1882, the Bills of Exchange Act was enacted by Parliament, which consolidated all these laws relating to negotiable instruments. This became the uniform law for England, Scotland, and Ireland when using negotiable instruments. The Bills of Exchange Act was drafted by Sir Mackenzie Chalmers, and one of the pertinent provisions of the Bills of Exchange Act of 1882 is Part 2, Section 3, which defines a Bills of Exchange and containing its elements. In the 19th century England, the Consumer Credit Act of 1974 was passed by the Parliament, and it tackled negotiable instruments regarding their restrictions, consequences, and defining who a holder in due course is. Currently, the Bills of Exchange Act of 1992 and the Consumer Credit Act of 1974 are still the prevailing laws regarding negotiable instruments, subject, however, to subsequent amendments.
Morning, Charlie. Good morning to you, Marshall. Say, Charlie, what have you got in your basket? Oh, Marshall, it's newly printed copies of my new book regarding the hardships of being a law student here in London. Can I interest you in one? Sure, I would love to have an idea of how hard it is to be a law student here in London. Oh, bollocks. I think I forgot my wallet at home. Will you accept bills of exchange, Charlie? Of course, Marshall. You're a trusted friend. Just write it out for £10. Here you go, Charlie. A bill of exchange for £10. Thank you, Marshall. Here's the book. Nice doing business with you. Good morning, Mr. Abeline. I am here to encash the bill that was given to me by Marshall, and he named you as the drawee of the bill. Very well, sir. Let me have a look at the bill. Ah, yes, this is indeed Sir Marshall's signature. Alright, give me a minute. Here you go, Mr. Charlie. £10. Thank you, sir. Lovely day to you.
In the pioneer days of America as a colonial settlement, the British monarchy was the reigning government. Even in these early days, the concept of taxation and commerce was very much an established ordeal. Due to the heavy and exorbitant taxing schemes of the British, actual currency in the form of coinage was in short supply and was too scarce to freely circulate through the colonies. The settlers then resorted to continuing on with their lives by adapting the concepts of barter, and most importantly, credit. Now, to be able to make credit tangible and easier to prove, promissory notes were commonly issued and transacted with. These notes represented some sort of value and took the place of actual money, to be able to bridge the gap that the lack of coinage caused. Now, unfortunately, parchment paper back then was very frail and flimsy. Hence, the life of said notes are far shorter and would easily get destroyed due to the often passing of hands from one person to another. But nonetheless, this method of transacting was the most common and most prevalent at the time when actual currency itself was a luxury of its own. As America became an independent nation, it has evolved to become a more stable sovereign with its newfound form of democratic government. 100 years after its independence, and several states added to it, the United States of America still lacked uniformity in its legislations. Other than its federally enacted laws, there are many variations of laws that depend which state you are in. This incompatibility was what set in motion an effort to start a process of standardizing its multiple states and newly acquired territories. Such effort resulted in establishing the Uniform Law Commission, whose goal is to be able to standardize the laws being enacted within the United States in pursuant to the constitutional provision that there be uniformity of legislation throughout the Union. One of such aspects that needed to be regulated and governed uniformly in accordance to federal standards was the aspect of trade and commerce. The Uniform Negotiable Instruments Act of 1896 was the first of its kind, in which the American Bar Association riled up prominent lawyers of different states to draft and submit to the government an outline of uniformity for all other states to adopt, ratify, and incorporate into their state laws as governing rules and standards with regards to commerce and negotiable instruments. The said Uniform Act is also a key point of derivation of the Negotiable Instruments Law in the Philippines as established by the Taft Commission in 1911. As the world evolved, so did the manner in which men conducted trade and commerce. The Uniform Commercial Code of 1952 was the evolution of the Simple Negotiable Instruments Act. This more comprehensive code includes and incorporates more aspects of the commercial industry, such as sales, exports, and tariffs. The UCC was the culmination of the effort to standardize the setting of government legislation on all aspects of modern commerce. It is not a law, but rather a comprehensive outline in which states may adapt to standardize and make said laws of commerce easier to translate and correlate with each other between the 50 states. Pennsylvania was the first state to adapt and incorporate the UCC in its state legislation. Eventually, many other states have adapted some, if not the entire portion of the UCC. Other American colonies and territories have also adapted the UCC, such as Guam and other American territories all over the world. Hello, Brown Hat John. Hey, what's up? I would like to buy the finest piece of lumber you have. The finest piece of lumber. That's gonna cost you about 10 shillings. How about that? 10 shillings? I don't think I have that right now. Would it be okay if I pay you in parchment paper? Parchment paper? How do you expect me to feed a family with parchment paper? Are you out of your mind? Okay. But it's not just a normal parchment paper, it's a promissory note. Oh, well, in that case, okay, I guess. Here you go. Cha-cha. Thank you for your finest piece of lumber. I shall buy another one next week. Okay, I guess. Bye.
During the pre-Hispanic period, the Philippines was already involved in barter trade with neighboring countries such as China, Java, Borneo, and Thailand. Cowrie shells were then adopted as a medium of exchange due to the inconvenient nature of the barter system. And piloncitos, which are small pieces of gold, became the first form of coinage, and it is believed that the inscription in that coin was used by the Chinese traders to identify the Philippines during the pre-Spanish era. During the Revolutionary period, the Spanish Filipino peso was replaced by a short-lived revolutionary currency with the 1898 Declaration of Independence. After the arrival of the Americans in 1898 and the subsequent surrender of General Aguinaldo to the Americans, the revolutionary coinage was taken from circulation and it was labeled illegal currency. During the Spanish colonization, the Code of Commerce is the law that is in effect at that time regarding the negotiable instruments. Coins were introduced back then. Cobs were the earliest coins that were brought in, and Spanish dos mundos were extensively circulated worldwide from 1732 to 1772 that also reached the Philippines. In 1901, the United States took over control of the Philippines and introduced a new currency. They introduced modern banking, credit, and currency systems, and all notes and coins issued before 1933 were converted from Spanish to English, and a 1 peso note was introduced in May 1918. During this period, the Philippines enacted the Negotiable Instruments Law of the Philippines, or Act No. 2031, which was patterned after the United States Uniform Negotiable Instruments Act of 1896 and the Uniform Commercial Code. At the present, the Congress has not modified any provision of this act. During the Japanese occupation, there were 2 types of notes issued in the Philippines. These war notes featured large denomination and no backup reserves, and the Filipinos called it the Mickey Mouse money. On the other hand, provinces and municipalities issued their own guerrilla notes or resistance currencies in modest denominations. With the creation of the Central Bank of the Philippines in 1949, an official Filipino currency was reintroduced. And in late 1960s, the currency became more Filipinized with the use of Filipino language and portraits of national heroes.
I'm curious about something. If this piece of paper can be accepted as payment, what did the people use back then? So, before the Spanish colonization, the Philippines is already engaged in barter with other countries and they were using piloncitos. So, when did the Philippines begin to use negotiable instruments? The negotiable instruments was introduced to the Filipinos only during the Spanish era, when the Code of Commerce was in force at that time, and modern banking, credit, and currency system was introduced during the American period. The negotiable instruments law was enacted during this period, and despite the passage of time, this law is still in effect.
Now we go to the examples of old negotiable instruments. We begin with old bills of exchange. The first picture depicts a foreign bill of exchange, the front portion. The next picture is the same foreign bill of exchange, except this time it's the dorsal portion. This bill of exchange was issued in the state of Philadelphia. The third picture is a bill of exchange issued in the state of Connecticut. The tenor of the instruments are gold and silver. Next, we go to old promissory notes. The first picture is a promissory note that was issued in the state of Texas. The currency is in dollars. If you would look at the date, it was issued in the year 1888. The next picture is an insurance promissory note that was issued in the state of Massachusetts. Next, we have an example of an order instrument, the currency being in dollars. Next up, we have old checks. The first picture is a 1904 Philippine Archipelago check, the currency of course being in Philippine peso. The next picture is the Philippine National Bank check that was issued in the year 1940. This is an example of an unused blank check. Next up, we have checks that were issued in the country of America, the New York check, in the year 1887. Now we go to the new versions of a bill of exchange, a promissory note, and a check. We begin with the new bills of exchange. This picture is an example of a modern bill of exchange. Next up, we have the new promissory notes. This picture is a picture of a promissory note, the first page. Next picture, this is a picture of a modern promissory note, the second page. Next up, we have the new checks. The first picture depicts a BDO check, of course issued here in the Philippines, dated 2012. Next up, we have a manager's check, dated 2017. And lastly, we have a bounce check that was issued in the year 2007.